introduce Professor Alston, I should say that Philip has informed me when it comes to introductions that he believes, and biographies, he believes in brevity. And so please know that although I'm going to follow his preference in the way I introduced him, what I'm about to say is only a very small portion of his tremendous achievements and impact in international law. Professor Philip Alston, as many of you know, teaches at the New York University Law School. As well as being the inaugural civil director, he was one of the founders of the European Society of International Law and the Australian and New Zealand Society of International Law. He was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, also on extrajudicial executions, and was the chair of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So it is no underestimation to say that Philip is really a behemoth in the field of international law, and we are incredibly lucky to have him here tonight delivering his lecture on human rights beyond tragedies and atrocities. So I'm going to hand over to Philip, who will deliver his lecture, and then at the end there will be some time for questions from the audience. But please join me in welcoming Philip Alston.
Thanks, Imogen. I think I might be more of a moth in international law than a behemoth, but anyway, it's lovely to be back here and to see so many old faces. I said to Ernst Wilhelm, who looked a bit shocked at what might be coming, that this is obviously a place to stay if you want longevity, because there are so many old friends who are still thriving here, which is great. Very grateful to Imogen for all she's done to organise this, and it really is a treat to be back here at the law school, even though this was not my law school, when I see this fancy room and all that goes with it. Just also to say it's wonderful to see old friends here who have taken the time to come, and I really appreciate that. Even one of my daughters who's come up from Melbourne. I'm delighted that Sylvie is able to be here, having lived with us in Canberra and spent a lot of time at ANU many years ago. So tonight I'm going to talk about an issue that I haven't actually addressed before, and you can tell me afterwards whether it works or not. The argument is fairly straightforward, although if I were to provide all of the necessary evidence, that would be rather more time-consuming and complicated. My argument is that if we stand back and look at what is happening in the field of international human rights law as a whole, we can observe a major turn towards what I might call atrocitization, or the criminalization of human rights. In other words, we are preoccupied with reacting to a limited range of atrocities and relying heavily upon criminal law and all that goes with it in responding. This emphasis has a major distorting effect in a number of ways, which I will spell out towards the end of the talk. I should mention, although this is not necessary for the vast majority of those here because I see before me immense expertise, but 2 points for dummies, if you'll excuse the expression, to go with the famous book series. First, when I talk about human rights, I'm assuming that economic, social and cultural rights are an integral part of that body of law. And secondly, I'm combining three bodies of law under the rubric of human rights, and they are human rights law proper, international humanitarian law, and international criminal law. Not all of their different aspects, but I'm seeing them as part of a sort of continuity, a spectrum, rather than as distinct fields in their own right. Of course, there's a lot of work to be done to really weave them together more effectively, but anyway, that's just a couple of preliminary points. The starting point in a way is with the vision of human rights that emerged after World War II, which was one that posited a lot of ideals and aspiration for a really fair and just society for everyone, one that would respect human dignity, and one that would promote a wide range of human rights. Now, we know that that vision has certainly had a great many challenges over the years. And what I'm not going to talk about tonight is my lifelong obsession, which is simply the neglect of economic and social rights and the extent to which they have been very much second-class citizens in almost every realm of human rights. But that's not what I'm actually going to be talking about specifically here. I want to say also in advance that there's a risk that I'll be misinterpreted or misunderstood. I will be critical of a lot of the developments that I will be talking about, but not in their own right. In other words, each of them looked at in isolation is a net good, is a very good thing. But what I'm trying to point to is that the aggregation of them is starting to push the overall regime in one very specific direction that I believe is problematically distorting. I want to start, although this is perhaps going back too far, by pointing to some of the major challenges that I think most people in the field would identify. And the purpose of this is really just to be able to draw more starkly the contrast between the challenges that we would identify if we're asked, okay, so what's your concern as a human rights proponent? And if we draw that list up, what I want to do at the end is then to compare it with where the emphasis is heading and where so many of the resources are actually going, and make the point that, of course, there is a huge disjunction there. So the challenges: rise of illiberalism and authoritarianism, conference here in a couple of days on populism and so on. As I think Harry Hobbs said outside, certainly a lot of the key populist/authoritarian leaders are off the scene now, but I don't think the phenomenon is any less threatening. Next, rising levels of racism and xenophobia, which will of course be greatly exacerbated by climate change. A backlash against gender equality and LGBT rights, so-called gender ideology in some European and other countries, Latin American. Rapidly growing inequality, along with high levels of extreme poverty. The need to make corporate accountability meaningful in relation to human rights. And I'm not going to talk about this tonight, but my own view is that pretty much the vast majority of what has so far been achieved is a very slight dent in the overall problem. that there is extraordinarily limited accountability for corporate actions, despite the number of people who work in the field and despite the number of celebratory analyses that have been undertaken. And finally, of course, the number of international and non-international armed conflicts around the world would also be on any list of issues that need to be addressed. The next step then is to look very briefly and again, unavoidably superficially, at the sort of solutions that have been proposed by those in the field. If we take issues like racism, gender inequality, exclusion of people with disabilities and so on, virtually all of the analyses that we read, or at least that I read, point to the importance of structural solutions that involve redistribution of resources and measures that address the underlying factors that contribute to these problems. Those working on issues of authoritarianism and populism are, I would say, generally agreed, leaving Marty Koskaniemi out of this, that economic discontent is a prime cause of much of the populist and illiberal movements that we're dealing with. If we go to inequality, the focus that most serious social justice movements, whether it's Oxfam or Eurodad or whoever, are looking at, and it's shared by scholars who are often working within a critical legal theory, a critical theory framework, is to focus on neoliberal policies, and especially the consequences of ever lower levels of taxation, deregulation and marketisation, slashing of government budgets, and the privatisation of previously public functions, such as utilities, transport, health, social care, education, and so on. These groups have all called for the restoration of a public sphere, the revival of the notion that there is a right to social protection and to a decent standard of living, and for policies that address rampant inequalities. Climate change, I don't need to talk much about because it's very much on, I hope, all of our minds. No greater challenge for any of us than climate change. But most of the analyses that look seriously at that end up pointing to the absolutely essential dimension of deep structural changes in society and in the allocation and distribution of resources. Anti-poverty advocates share this emphasis, of course, on structural causes. But interestingly, there's another element in the poverty area which is concern about the criminalisation of poverty. And maybe this is what prompted my initial foray into this, but it actually only occurred to me when I was putting my paper together. When I visited the United States as Special Rapporteur on Poverty, I wrote at some length about the criminalisation of poverty that occurs in the US. Classic instances, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but in places where there's really major problems of homelessness, the response has very often focused simply on criminalisation. Don't build more housing. Don't provide deeper forms of assistance, but make it illegal to sleep on the streets. Make it illegal to pee in public or to pee on the streets. And this in a country and in cities that have no public toilets. and then get poor people into a cycle of criminality. It was sort of tragic when I actually saw it in person, because I spoke to a lot of these people in LA and San Francisco and others, and it would start off with a sort of citation or whatever for being on the sidewalk. That would then be elevated into a misdemeanor because they didn't pay, and perhaps because they didn't go to court. Homeless people are scared stiff of leaving their trolleys or their other belongings anywhere in order to go to a courthouse, apart from the fact that they don't have any resources to do so or to pay any fines. They are then convicted at a certain point, which in turn means that they're not even eligible for public housing anymore, which is natural, of course. You know, if someone's really poor and they're convicted, of course you make sure they can't get access to public housing. I won't go on about it, but it has, I think, important parallels with what I'm going to talk about. When Nikki Haley, who was she was the UN ambassador, but she was also the designated Trump administration cabinet member who responded to my report, she said the report was unnecessary, politically biased, factually wrong, and a waste of US taxpayer dollars. She took particular exception to my comment about criminalisation, noting indignantly that nowhere in America is it a crime to be poor. In a letter to various members of Congress, she said that I'd wasted the UN's time and resources deflecting attention from the world's worst human rights abusers. You know where they all were, of course, in Africa. And focusing instead on the wealthiest and freest country in the world. Sadly, this also reflects the mentality that is at play in what I'm now talking about, albeit less consciously. The subtext of the criminalisation that I'm about to describe does seem to be that the real atrocities that we should be focusing on are committed in Africa and Asia. And so that's where all the attention should be focused. So then I want to look at some recent developments that I think make the point of where priorities are moving. An easy starting point is Ukraine, where you've had the standard human rights responses. There was immediately an independent commission of inquiry set up by the Human Rights Council. It has significant resources. It's actually made 10 visits to Ukraine since June. That itself is without precedent, but it turns out that this commission, and I'll come back to it in a minute, is actually only one actor in a very crowded field of human rights actors. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court visited Ukraine with record speed and accompanied by several dozen investigators, which has never happened before as far as I'm aware. Many of those were supported by unprecedented financial contributions made by Western governments. In July, the New York Times reported that, quote, hundreds of international experts, investigators and prosecutors have descended on Ukraine from an alphabet soup of international agencies. But even these turned out to be a drop in the bucket. Ukraine's judicial system is now, quote, almost wholly devoted to investigating war crimes, with most of its 8,300 prosecutors fanned out across the country collecting evidence. Elsewhere in Europe, 14 EU member states have opened separate investigations into acts carried out in Ukraine. The G7 agreed last month to set up a network to coordinate these various allegations and expedite prosecutions. Still not enough. 30th of November, 2 weeks ago, President of the European Commission announced an initiative to set up a specialised court backed by the UN to investigate and prosecute Russia's crime of aggression. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court promptly responded by telling the meeting of states parties to the court that he opposed that initiative by Ursula von der Leyen, and he called for states to avoid fragmentation and instead work on consolidation. Before leaving Ukraine, I just want to mention that the Commission of Inquiry that was set up actually has the granddaddy of all mandates in the sense that it is absolutely maximalist. But the main thrust, again, is on criminalisation. So its mandate, A, to investigate all alleged violations and related crimes and establish the facts, etc. B, to collect, consolidate and analyse evidence of such violations and to systematically record and preserve all information, documentation and evidence, etc., with a view to future legal proceedings. D, to identify individuals and entities responsible for violations or crimes to make sure they are held accountable. If you haven't got the message, we'll move on to E, to make recommendations in particular on accountability measures, all with a view to ending impunity and ensuring accountability, including individual criminal responsibility. This is actually a ridiculous mandate. It's ludicrously broad, and at least as far as my own experience is relevant, I think a commission such as this is singularly ill-equipped to undertake the criminalisation agenda. I say that based on very limited experience. I was on a Security Council Commission of Inquiry into the Central African Republic and an independent commission looking at problems in Kyrgyzstan. And in both of those instances, we made a total mess of efforts to establish individual criminal responsibility. We were utterly ill-equipped. And I don't think that the Ukraine or most of the other commissions are much better equipped. But the message I'm trying to convey is simply that the sponsors, the mindset is this is all about criminal responsibility. That's where we're moving. Then move on to investigative mechanisms, which some of you will have heard of and some of you may not have. This is a sort of new genre. It's a way of reacting to basically the ineffectuality of other techniques. So in particular, in both Syria and Myanmar, we've gone through the cycle. We've had a special rapporteur, we've moved on to a commission of inquiry, and then we've set up an independent investigation mechanism, got different names. These mechanisms are very well funded and staffed by human rights standards, but their task is not to prosecute, not to indict, but rather to gather all of the information and evidence which would enable prosecutions to be launched by others, either the International Criminal Court, maybe a specialised international court, or domestic courts that are using universal jurisdiction or some other basis, and I'll mention that in a moment. In fact, on Syria, which has a long-standing mechanism that was set up in 2016, the Secretary-General has also recommended, just in the past couple of months, the creation of a new institution to investigate issues relating to missing persons in Syria. And I'm sure that too will be well funded. In 2017, one of these mechanisms was set up to look at ISIS in Iraq, the Islamic State. And it's quite amusing. I'm not going to be able to go into the big issue here of resources, which I've been trying to document. It's incredibly difficult, even for someone who's spent most of his life buried in the UN system, to ascertain what's going on in budgetary terms in the UN. Really difficult. And when we talk about accountability, all these accountability mechanisms, it would be nice if there was a little financial accountability, but it's very opaque. So the only way I found out about the budget for this Iraq-focused body called UNITAD was because the prosecutor of the criminal court complained bitterly in relation to Ukraine that his office had something like $50 million available to investigate 16 situations around the world, whereas in his past job, which was the Iraq job, he had a budget of $30 million. So $30 million is being spent on trying to record the crimes committed by this Islamic State terrorist group in a small part of Iraq over a small number of years. And that is well over half the budget that the prosecutor has for all of his various investigations. There are many other examples I could give budget-wise, but I better move on quickly. There's another investigative mechanism for Myanmar. It reported earlier this year that it's now got more than 3 million information items in its repository. You've got to ask yourself when and how you think these great achievements are going to bear fruit. How many prosecutions do we expect from Myanmar? Who do we expect to undertake them? And what's the result going to be in terms of the situation in Myanmar and the people in Myanmar? And I don't mean the individual victims who, at least in theory, will be assisted by these mechanisms. A couple of recent reports came out earlier this year, one by a group at Oxford, another by the International Commission of Jurists, both saying this is great stuff, these mechanisms. And so what we need now is a standing international independent mechanism which will perform these functions for all countries in the world. And there need only be some referral, and that body, which presumably would be very costly in terms of staffing, given the aspirations that are there for it, would then be able to respond. So the vision that so many people in this field have is to pump up these investigative mechanisms that are designed to facilitate future prosecutions. I better move fast. The next related development is universal jurisdiction. Just to say that the push by the Rome Statute for countries to set up units that will prosecute on the basis of universal jurisdiction has been quite effective. And what we are starting to see now is a lot more of these prosecutions taking place. Some high-profile successful ones in Germany, Sweden, France, over the course of the last couple of years. But the hope for those working in this field is that this will become a real growth industry, that there'll be lots of prosecutions, and no doubt they're licking their lips at the prospect of Ukraine and various accused Russian perpetrators being found in countries outside those two. Sanctions I don't have time to talk about in the length that I would like to. Sanctions are a very important tool. I'm treating them as though they are quasi-criminal for this purpose, in the sense that it's a way of punishing individuals who are accused of particular crimes. Human Rights Day was Saturday last week. You'll be delighted to hear that, maybe someone here wrote it, Penny Wong's contribution was an article in the Sydney Morning Herald entitled "Why I'm Imposing Sanctions on Human Rights Abusers." That's what human rights is all about. In Canada, Mélanie Joly, Foreign Minister, announced sanctions on those complicit in gross and systematic human rights violations in Russia, Iran and Myanmar. In the United Kingdom, James Cleverly, Foreign Minister, wrote a story in The Guardian entitled "Britain is not a passive observer on the world stage. We want oligarchs and dictators to fear us." Sanctions are one of the most important tools, and thanks to Brexit, we now have control over them. He was proud to say that the UK is now enforcing national sanctions against over 2,000 individuals and 400 entities across the world. I'll spare you the statement that Secretary Blinken put out in the United States. But they're all focused on these so-called Magnitsky sanctions. And that's the big thing, the big push. Sanctions against individuals. The reason why Magnitsky sanctions are so popular? Almost cost-free and almost certain to achieve very little. But the politicians can say they've taken action, strong action, punitive measures, sanctions have been imposed. Final example, sexual violence. Feminist commentators, lots of others, have long pointed out that the broad agenda reflected in something like the UN's Women, Peace and Security program, dating back to the year 2000, has very often been skewed heavily towards a focus on sexual violence and the prosecution of offenders, when in fact, if one was serious about trying to address those crimes, one would have to go much more deeply to look at the situation in which women find themselves in these situations. I remember vividly my own visit to the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 2010. Hillary Clinton had been there just before and declared that the major, most important challenge was prosecution of rapists. It's an important issue, but I don't know that you would have met many people in the DRC, including women defenders, who would have said that was the key entry point, and that prosecuting a handful, as it's inevitably going to be, of perpetrators is going to address any of the underlying problems in a country like the DRC. 2 weeks ago, the UK hosted a conference, Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict, signed by over 50 countries, the declaration that came out of it, including ours. The declaration makes some mention of the broader agenda, but if you look at it, it's all about prosecution. We're going to make these guys pay. We're going to push criminal prosecution. I will skip over the justifications that are offered for criminalisation because I'm running out of time. Arguments like, well, you've got to prioritise somewhere, well, this is something we can get a grasp on, this is something that we're good at. If we get a foot in this door, then we can build on other endeavours to make a more comprehensive and balanced regime and so on. So let me spell out what I see as the consequences of criminalisation. If I leave enough time for questions, I can explain further later. So the consequences, first of all, ideational. It distorts our understanding of what human rights are, what they're for, and how they should be realised. It involves a relentless narrowing of the vision of the aspirations and ultimately the meaning of rights. Normative consequences. It reinforces an atrocity-centred normative hierarchy. When we talk about atrocities, of course I should have mentioned this before in case some of you won't know it, atrocities are essentially defined as genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. A whole range of civil and political rights are not covered by the term atrocity crimes, and virtually all economic and social rights are either ignored or marginalised. Third, empowerment and disempowerment. Who's empowered by these initiatives? Lawyers, governments. It's great. It narrows the way in which human rights violations must be understood because we have to try to fit them within the criminal law framework in order to achieve action. More importantly, it disempowers social movements and the forces that are absolutely indispensable in promoting progressive human rights outcomes. There's talk of victim empowerment. This seems to be more rhetorical than actual, and even if that happens, it's no substitute for the disempowerment that results from the narrowed focus on atrocity crimes. Most of us are not, I'm sorry to say this, affected by atrocity crimes, but most of us suffer from a range of human rights issues that need to be addressed. And this is not where all the resources are going. Targets, fourth. The focus is on individual perpetrators. Societies basically get off scot-free, no matter what their role has been in facilitating, enabling, and so on. The broader systems are not challenged and may well remain intact. Distributions of resources and power are usually left completely untouched. The atrocity focus is also entirely compatible with the priorities reflected in the project of neoliberalism. Markets are made safer and issues of redistribution are ignored. Fifth, the geopolitical distortion. This is a rerun of the old North-South issue because it's the North, or particularly the West, funding prosecutions and courts endlessly these days to investigate violations that are carried out in the South, in the global South. Framing, in temporal terms, the focus is on the past rather than the future. Concern is with cure rather than prevention. Expertise, number 7, the expertise that's needed is slanted by the focus on atrocities and criminal investigations. If you want a job, go into international criminal law, stay out of human rights. Resources, as I said, resource allocations are increasingly distorted. The UN budget is being reduced, only slightly, but reduced, for things like treaty bodies, special procedures, research, a range of other things. It's being significantly increased for these mechanisms through the Human Rights Council, and voluntary contributions by countries in Europe, the United States, probably Australia, I don't know, are very high in terms of all of these specialist criminal mechanisms. They can't get enough of them. Delighted to fund them. No money for anything else, sorry. What can be done in a nutshell? First of all, we need to recognise and acknowledge the problem, and it hasn't been called out in any comprehensive way yet. Second, learn from the other areas in which the strategy of criminalisation has failed, because it does little to address underlying causes. Third, one possibility is to expand the definition of atrocity. It's a very good book that just came out by a guy named Randall DeFalco, which proposes specifically that be done. If there is no alternative but to face up to the criminalisation of the regime, then he's right. We need to expand what constitutes an atrocity. So forms of hunger, maybe homelessness, maybe even inequality might be pushed in there. But in fact, that's doubling down and making the problem worse if we still aspire to have a meaningful, broad-focused human rights regime. Fourth, we need to deepen our exploration of what a structural approach actually requires. I won't develop that further here. And finally, just a note, because most of us here are interested in international law, we need to address our own déformation professionnelle, as the French say. In other words, the tendency to see everything through the lens that we are able to see with. And we need to start looking more broadly at the different things that a balanced human rights regime should be undertaking. I'll leave it at that. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Geoff, for a wonderful speech. So I'll open the floor. We do have a bit of time for questions. I don't know if we have a mic.
I'm not sure I understand.
I don't think we have a mic, so whoever wants to ask a question, I'll ask you to speak loudly. But do you have any questions in the audience? Yeah.
I was just wondering if you see this as being driven mostly by states and multilateral fora, or if you also see it by civil society and NGOs, and if there's a distinction in a domestic context with that level of advocacy.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good question. I do see it as being driven heavily by NGOs. I'm not here to criticise or worse, Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International or some of the others, International Commission of Jurists. I think they're all doing what they think is best. They're doing what they understand best. And I don't think that they are really focused on the extent to which this is really distorting the regime. I think there are similarities at the national level, but obviously what I've been talking about directly is the international. But the use of universal jurisdiction and various other things will start to bring this home to us as well.
Helen?
Hi, Paul. Fantastic talk. Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Helen.
I was just wondering, in relation to the right to a healthy environment, the ACT is just committed to that and will legislate next year. But if you look at the map of the world of who recognises the right to a healthy environment, we've got the US, Canada, Asia, UK, Australia all missing. Is that one mechanism of improving the situation, to actually tackle corporations like Rio Tinto bombing Aboriginal heritage sites?
Right. So, I mean, there's been significant progress that with the right to a healthy environment. The Human Rights Council recognised it last year and the General Assembly recognised it in July this year. Interestingly enough, there were no votes against it and just a couple of abstentions, but it was noteworthy that at least the United States and the United Kingdom and a few others then issued the proverbial explanation of vote, where they basically said, you can do this if you like, but we're not ready for it and it doesn't really mean much. In other words, it's not binding, it's not going to change what we do, etc., etc. But that's all right. You'd expect countries like that, with governments like that, to be dragging their feet on this. But I think it's a very important breakthrough. I guess, I mean, my point to make it relevant to my talk is to say that you've got idiots like Ian Fry hammering away at the importance of climate change in his capacity as special rapporteur on that subject, and governments nodding and saying, yeah, nice report, Ian, good, good. But no resources at all being put into the climate change issue at the UN. The governments that are getting incredibly excited about putting truckloads of money into criminal prosecutions are not interested in putting any money into really trying to deepen the work that Ian Fry and others in the human rights area can do to really make climate change a human rights issue.
Okay, Joe?
Thank you so much, Philip, and welcome back to ANU. I guess my question is about, or provocation is about the faith you place in the human rights frameworks. If I understand you correctly, the suggestion is if we focused instead on the range of things you mentioned at the beginning of the talk, which are very broad indeed, social services, the whole panoply of governance, and applied a sort of the human rights frame to all of those, then that would fix those situations. And we're just applying the human rights frame in the wrong place. But if we shifted focus and brought a human rights lens to climate change or environment or anything you wish, that would in some way transform the situation. So I was just curious, because you talked about those as, you kept coming back to that phrase, we're not being underlined. But why would you think that the human rights frame?
Well, I stand indicted along with all the others working on gender equality or anti-racism for making that analysis. I don't think there are, maybe there are a number of proponents of gender equality who believe that prosecutions are going to be the key route by which to change misogyny in the world. I'm not dismissing the relevance of prosecutions. A well-placed prosecution can send an important message. But in terms of changing a culture, in terms of changing the economic structures that generate and uphold discrimination against women, against people of different ethnicities and races, I don't think prosecutions are going to do much. It's not to say that I'm then rosy-eyed and say, well, look, if you just focused on economic and social rights, everything would be solved. But we're not spending any time on economic and social rights as an institutional regime. You know, there's a lot of token reporting that's done, including previously by me, but the system itself does not take these rights seriously, is not exploring how they could make a difference, not looking at, say, the homelessness crisis around the world, which has been focused on by a few special rapporteurs and a handful of others, but it's a chronic problem that leads to many other human rights violations, and it gets no attention at all from these institutions, none. I could go on, but I just want to emphasise that I'm not being, starry-eyed, thinking that you simply shift all the resources and that will make the difference. These problems are intractable, they're very difficult, but I don't think they're going to be helped, let alone resolved, by spending truckloads of money on criminalising a handful of atrocity crimes.
I've got two more in the audience, so Anthea and then Matthew.
At the very end, I was very taken with your phrase, the French phrase about professional, being deformed by your professional lens. And this is something that I see very much in my own work at the moment between economists and security types and lawyers who look at things with such a strong lens of how they've been trained, but also wanting to defend the values and the institutional role that they have. And so I completely agree with the diagnosis. Well, it's one of the things I'm trying to work out is how do you move people past that? And it seems some people are more psychologically entrenched and some people are more open. There are institutional things that can encourage it or discourage it. There are incentives. But have you thought much about how you move people beyond this tendency?
I think that we are, this is an overstatement, that we are all largely unilingual. That's, we're indoctrinated. You go to law school, you go to sociology school or economics or whatever, and you learn to think and to write and to understand the world through that lens. It's very hard then to become bilingual, to learn one of the other disciplines. I think obviously education is important, the sort of things that students are asked to study. I'm a bit, this is a self-serving comment, but at New York University where I teach, we have many hundreds of foreign LLMs. And those who come from particularly Western Europe, but also Latin America, have, the first couple of classes they'll sort of say, are we going to have to keep reading this crap about anthropology and political science and economics, or are you going to get into the law sometime soon? And of course my answer is just hang in there, because I hope, but maybe you'll come out disillusioned, but I hope you'll see by the end of the semester that law ain't the answer on its own, that law can achieve all too little unless it's accompanied by a broader focus. But I totally agree with you that it's very hard to get most of our colleagues, listen, you've got to look into the economics of this. Oh, economics, no, I don't do that. Sorry, that's for my colleague. Where is he? He's an economist, he does that, not me. But I've long argued that if you want to know where so much of human rights policy is made, you look at the tax system. That's where it's made. Those are the groups who are privileged, who are disprivileged, who are rewarded, who are encouraged, and human rights people almost never look at tax policy because they say we don't understand it.
Thank you. We have time for Matthew as the last question, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
Well, thank you, Philip. I fear you have just fired an enormous salvo at my last 4 years of work.
You could apologise now if you like, Matthew.
Heading the Middle East and Africa division. But at the same time, I remember a woman I met as ambassador to the DRC in eastern DRC in around about 2013. And speaking to her in Swahili, a language I grew up with in Tanzania, so they gave me an advantage in that situation. I said to her, what is the biggest problem you face? She was a very feisty woman leader. She said, the biggest problem we have is we cannot go down to the river to get water, nor can our daughters because we will be raped by the very soldiers, the guards who are guarding you at this moment, which brought it all into very sharp focus. And listening to the victims in The Hague, I have been constantly struck by their desire that impunity be addressed. And the ICC has been an imperfect body, but I still think it has an important role. That said, what I didn't hear in your very incredible lecture, very punchy and one that really makes us think, what I did not hear about was the massive amounts of money that go into development assistance based on economic and social rights, economic and social vectors, far more than we ever put into international criminal justice. So I'd be interested in your view from a UN and human rights context about how that can be used, because clearly there's a failure with that process as well.
Yeah, I mean, the last thing that I want to do is to, suggest that any of us have been working on the wrong issues. I really am trying to get the overview here of where, and it's not the fault of any one group that this is happening, but I'm trying to sort of draw the broad lines. I think that to take the ICC example, every book that I read on atrocity crimes and on international criminal law is, of course, focused on the victims who will say, the only thing I want in life is for the punishment of the person who did it. Sadly, that's a self-selected group. They're the ones who are within that remit, within that ambit. That's their only hope. But I don't think that is the message that is going to come from a broader population group. I can talk about that at great length, but I won't. So the bigger issue that you raise is what about all of the money that is spent on development assistance and so on. Here I have to admit to growing scepticism again in old age. Human rights have been determinedly kept out of the Sustainable Development Goals, not only by China, but by almost all countries. They don't want it in there. Most of the development assistance that is given is not, in fact, aimed at anything like economic and social rights. It's aimed at certain economic and social programs, but there is no consideration given to distribution, given to the sort of factors that a human rights analysis would point to. And what we're actually seeing in the UN right now, I think, the Secretary General and particularly the Deputy Secretary General have almost abandoned even the Sustainable Development Goals, or particularly the Sustainable Development Goals, to the private sector. There is no way that we, the United Nations, or we as the governments can fulfill these rights. It is only through public-private partnerships. Public-private partnerships are about profit for the private sector. That's what the private sector is about. Why would it be trying to improve the situation of the poor or even the lower middle classes? You and I wouldn't if we were running a business. That's not what we're there for. So even the Sustainable Development Goals that are still sort of held in very high esteem, wrongly so in my view now, are not in fact doing what should be done if we took seriously, I mean, if you take sexual violence, if you take rape, what sort of, if we were to sit down as a group and say, okay, you've got $1 billion, what are you going to do with it? You wouldn't say, let's prosecute a handful of people. My God, the DRC, the justice system, you know it better than I do. The generals that I met with, the prisons that I saw, money down the drain, frankly. So what would you come up with for your $1 billion? it would look very differently, I believe, than the sort of development assistance that is currently being provided by the vast majority of governments.
Thank you, Philip. That does bring us to the end of our time. So just please everyone join me again.